but you have gotten over it.
I don't think you ever get over something like that. And
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. So that was the voice of Michael Massee, who appeared in The Crow opposite Brandon Lee, and that is his response 12 years later in 2005 to feelings of guilt regarding that incident. For me, the biggest disparity between Rust and The Crow is really in the area you'd least expect. But before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do like, share, leave a comment, and let's get started. So the question here is, what legal outcome is likely? And in this respect, we're going to go out of the scenario from Rust, out of the information in terms of Rust, and we're going to go and look at the intertextualities with another film and see how that film informs the situation in Rust. And I must say, I found this so fascinating. I initially wanted to cover the Crow and Midnight Rider in a single episode, but there was so much that was interesting in The Crow that I decided to do them as two separate episodes. So I will be dealing with Midnight Rider in a separate episode. In the article, DA announces negligence caused death of The Crow actor Brandon Lee, published on history.com, we're given the result of that particular case in the title, negligence. Negligence, sure, but what was the legal result? The North Carolina District Attorney, Jerry Spivey, eventually decided against bringing charges against Crow Vision, the production company making the movie. According to the Washington Post, quote, after a 2-month investigation, Wilmington District Attorney Jerry Spivey determined that while several crew members were negligent, no one intended to harm Brandon Lee, and that his death was, quote, the result of ignoring basic and well-recognized safety guidelines, end quote. That was the result of a film accident that happened almost 30 years ago. In this analysis, we're going to look at The Crow, but also, as I say, just touch on a recent production called Midnight Rider that had a very different legal result, and see what bearing this might have on Rust and potentially some of its crew members. In order to do that, I probably need to define intertextuality to those of you who are not that familiar with this channel, not that familiar with me, who haven't read any of my books, right? So what is intertextuality? For those new to this channel and to True Crime Rocket Science, intertextuality is a true crime rocket science-ism, in the same way that post-meditation is also a true crime rocket science-ism, mentioned a few episodes ago. You won't hear any other channel, you won't hear law enforcement or any investigator using these terms because they're new, because I invented them. They're new, and they're, I think, a better way to describe some things that have gone on for too long without being acknowledged, without being defined, let alone being named, defined, and described. When we talk about intertextuality, we mean something beyond the strict dictionary definition, which is simply the relationship between texts. In the true crime scenario, so if we talk about true crime intertextuality, or the intertextuality between an X case and a Y case, what we are doing is we are investigating similar patterns in similar scenarios, but in completely different narratives. Often the semantics across these completely different true crime narratives are startlingly similar. So, for example, what statements are made by a certain suspect in a particular situation often corresponds to another suspect in another situation. It's just quite interesting. And so on the question of guilt, what does Michael Massee, the person responsible for shooting Brandon Lee, what does he say about feelings of guilt? So that's just one area that's quite interesting. Intertextuality is a valuable tool to thin slice into a case using information that's already been done and dusted in another case. In other words, it's a tool to gain insight quickly, even though we may not be in possession of all the legal documents, such as the discovery. It's also a way potentially to sort of look into the future of a true crime case by looking into the past of another true crime case. So how useful or powerful is intertextuality? Well, it really depends on how deeply you know your cases. Not only the case that you're working on, but also the case you're probing for intertextuality. So let's now look into intertextualities with The Crow. Filming of The Crow began in February 1993. Around midnight on the morning of March 31st, the cast and crew were filming a scene in Wilmington. This was at the Carroll Co. Studios, and that's in North Carolina. As Brandon Lee entered a room, another actor shot him from a distance of 15 to 20 feet. The gun was supposed to have been loaded with blanks, and police later found a .44 bullet had entered Lee's abdomen and lodged in his spine, fatally wounding him. He died in the hospital hours later of internal injuries, blood loss, and heart failure. And apparently part of where this bullet caused a lot of damage was it cut off the lower end, I believe, of the aorta. So it unfortunately hit a major artery. A similarity between both films is that both victims, Helena Hutchins and Brandon Lee, both suffered for hours and suffered terrible blood loss for a length of time before dying. Another similarity is that they both suffered wounds in a generally similar area. It was the front of their bodies, and it was also the chest or abdominal area. One of the main differences with Rust is the distance the projectile traveled in The Crow. The fact that this one traveled 15 to 20 feet, almost 10 times further, and still hit the actor and was fatal, feels a little like bad luck. It feels like a bad fluke accident, doesn't it? Because Massee wasn't really required to aim with pinpoint accuracy at Lee, but as it turned out, he did. In Rust, the projectile traveled just an arm's length, maybe 2.5 to 3 feet, and then hit the director behind the cinematographer as well. So another difference is two crew members were badly injured, one fatally, and by an actor, whereas in The Crow, an actor shot a fellow actor. I'm not 100% sure if this was a rehearsal, as in Rust, or if the cameras were rolling. What we do know was it was in the script for the fun boy character to shoot Lee's character, and Lee was supposed to die in the script. In Rust, no shooting was supposed to have happened in the church. To repeat, the script in the Crow required the actor to fire on the other actor. In Rust, that wasn't the case in the fatal scene, and we also have Baldwin denying he pulled the trigger. So you don't actually have Michael Massee saying, oh no, I didn't pull the trigger, the gun fired itself. But to add an element of intrigue, in The Crow, according to the actor involved, quote, I wasn't even supposed to be handling the gun until we started shooting the scene and the director changed it, end quote. So there is kind of a last-minute revision scenario going on, right? According to The Independent, the co-screenwriter John Shirley, who left the film before the final drafts, he was apparently very upset that he was let go from the project because his script was less violent, and he feels that there would never have been a gun going off, certainly not when it did, if they'd stuck to his script. So it's interesting that there was changes to the script, perhaps last minute, but one certainly gets the idea that is intertextual between the two films. We know there were also last-minute revisions to Rust. The script was changed during the lunch break, minutes before the shooting. It's unclear if or how these revisions had any bearing on the scene in the church. Given that the script supervises one of the parties suing Baldwin or the production, I suppose one would assume that the script didn't call for what ultimately happened. Even so, the bottom line legally is intent. There wasn't any intent in The Crow, and neither was there in Rust, right? Well, I think there might be a slight deviation in terms of intent on Rust. If it wasn't in the script to fire, and the actor can be shown to have fired intentionally, but believing the rounds inside the firearm were dummy rounds, then I'm not sure whether the legal outcome will be any different. It might be. We can see that because 2 people were seriously injured and the firing of the firearm wasn't in the script, the situation in Rust appears, certainly on the face of it, to be more serious than in The Crow. According to History.com, quote, as the police investigation began, little was certain about how Lee died, and rumors circulated that the film set was jinxed because there had been a series of accidents, or that his death had been plotted by some unknown enemy, end quote. So there is another intertextuality there with Rust. I think there have been rumors, there have been stories and ideas, there are comments every now and then from people saying, they believe this was intentional and this or that reason. I don't put much stock in those, but the fact is the rumors are swirling in a similar way as in The Crow. Did these rumors have any impact on the legal outcome? Not really. I also think there's a difference between the jinxedness of The Crow, if that's a word, and the problems, the accidental discharges, quote unquote, accidental discharges on Rust. I think the difference is most of the crew on The Crow may have agreed that they were dealing with unlucky situations. A crew member driving a cherry picker was electrocuted when he drove into a ditch on the first day of shooting on The Crow. On the third night of shooting, the prop truck caught fire. A carpenter was also electrocuted, and a stuntman fell badly through a rooftop set, injuring multiple ribs. Besides that, the set suffered hurricane damage and freezing temperatures during the 9 weeks of filming. And because of this inclement weather, everyone became ill. The list goes on. I'll put a link in the description you can actually read through all of the travails, all of the bad luck, all of these incidents that took place on The Crow. The situation in Rust is different in that the so-called accidents, and there were a series of them, were related to firearms and an explosive. In The Crow, there was, as far as I know, just a single firearms-related incident, and that was the incident itself. That's unless you count the prop truck catching fire, right? In Rust, there were at least 3 firearms-related discharges prior to the incident itself, and over a relatively short period. In terms of issues with the crew, there was apparently a disgruntled sculptor on The Crow. I haven't been able to confirm that, but I do think when you have disgruntled crew members, that can raise the stress levels of a production significantly. And when you have more than one disgruntled crew member, those stress levels rise even further. Now I want to deal with another section, behind schedule. The impression one gets with the $15 million budget The Crow was that the crew were frequently behind schedule. You might not think the Rust crew were behind schedule, but I think working on a low-budget film with a tight budget and a tight schedule means everyone is on the clock and watching the clock, and Baldwin has said as much. In a rush scenario, which was clearly the case in The Crow, the likelihood of making mistakes with dummies and blanks simply rises. According to The Independent, quote, both dummies and blanks, though, in contravention of usual safety procedures, had hastily been fabricated by taking out the gunpowder from real bullets because of the time pressure crew members were under. Somehow, the lead tip added to one of these dummies had become lodged down the barrel during the second unit shoot, because the quarter charge wasn't sufficient to propel it all the way out, end quote. Now, I don't think you need to be a firearms expert to understand what is going on there. The bottom line is that because of a rushing scenario, because of time pressure, the removal of bullets was rushed. And as a result of that, a mistake was made. And that is exactly the contention I've made occurred in Rust, is that after lunch, there was that one bullet remaining, and it was probably loaded in a rush, and perhaps without properly checking it. So we see a similar pattern here, but the legal issue again is intent. Another issue is whether those in charge of the production could have or should have reasonably foreseen that given the tight schedule and given the accidental nature of the set, safety precautions or interventions ought to have been enacted. You might not think too much about this question, but lawmakers need to, in order to address future legalities in similar cases going forward. So it's not just that one's got to look at Rust in isolation, one's also got to look at lessons that can be learned from Rust and applied in the legal aspect in future. So it is possible that Rust may set a legal precedent in how quote-unquote accidents need to be monitored, reported, and responded to. And I mean this where it goes further than the industry standards or protocols. It may actually show there's a legal aspect to the too cavalier, too money-motivated, penny-pinching flouting of protocols. So legal restrictions might be applied to movies in ways in the future, in ways that they haven't been thus far. So, for example, if live rounds are found on set, instead of someone just being fired, they might need to be reported to the authorities. That might be something to consider. And now let's deal with the armorer's behavior in The Crow. According to an article in Ranker, quote, first, the weapons master for The Crow was sent away for the day, and the prop master filled the .44 caliber gun used in the scene with blanks without checking the barrel, end quote. I don't think it takes a rocket scientist to say or to see that these accidental discharges, so-called, they don't happen because someone checked properly. They happen because somebody didn't check properly. And why did somebody not check properly? What's the obvious answer to that? I think what's interesting here is that despite admitting he didn't check the barrel, no charges were brought. Again, it seems to come down to intent. And then the next section, no guilt, and this applies to the clip I played at the beginning of this episode. For me, the biggest disparity between Rust and The Crow is really in the area you'd least expect. Michael Massee suffered from severe guilt and actually took off work for a few years after the incident. 12 years later, in 2005, he said,
But you have gotten over it.
I don't think you ever get over something like that and say, no, I've gone through.
What's interesting with the Michael Massee interview, and I'll put a link to that in the description as well, it's from 2005, is he seems to sort of say repeatedly that he doesn't really want to talk about, although he's talking about it here, he hasn't spoken about what happened with Brandon Lee in the past. And that's something we can also contrast with Alec Baldwin going on to ABC within a fairly short time, a month and a half, and speaking at length about the events and not being particularly emotional about it. I'm not saying he was unemotional, but there were times when he was talking about what happened to Elena and saying, did she faint, where he does seem fairly matter of fact. And one can contrast that with Michael Massee, who seems to take to heart the events far more than Alec Baldwin.
Do you feel guilt?
No. I feel that there is. I feel that someone is responsible for what happened, and I can't say who that is, but I know it's not me. And the second.
So yeah, you have Michael Massee saying, "I don't think you ever get over something like that." And this is in stark contrast not only to what Baldwin said, as I say, barely 2 months after the incident, but also how Baldwin seemed to be moving on and enjoying Christmas, posting Christmas messages on Instagram. most people would, I think, feel guilt. And what most people would or should do is the key legal question surrounding the culture of the Rust production in general, I think, in terms of its approach to crew safety, to industry protocols, and to crew complaints. So that is probably going to be the legal test, is what would the reasonable man have done? What would most people have done in this particular case? And that brings us to the final part, film scrubbed. According to the Washington Post, quote, there was never a question about the technical ability to finish the movie. And that's a reference to The Crow. And that's according to producer Ed Pressman. But there was a serious question psychologically, and it really revolved around Proyas. Alex Proyas at first did not want to go on with the film. He was destroyed by the accident and so devastated he had no heart to continue. It was only because Eliza and later the whole cast and crew appealed to him that he started to consider it, end quote. And so the same question sort of comes up with Rust. Will there be a feeling of wanting to continue with the film? Will there be a feeling of completing the film as a tribute to Helena? Will there be a feeling from the director that they want to keep going? And so interestingly, as a tribute to Lee, the Crow crew came back together and production resumed and the film was completed. It went on to become a blockbuster at the box office, making almost $100 million off a modest budget. With Rust, what do you think is going to happen? Is it going to resume? Is production going to resume? And I think it's doubtful. And I think the fact that 6 crew left the set and 2 remaining crew members are suing the producers and 1 or 2 other crew members. Anyway, I think that gives you an idea of how little glue was holding this small production together compared to The Crow. And I think if you just take the fact that The Crow was ultimately made, it shows solidarity of purpose. It shows, that making this as a tribute to the actor, shows that there are good hearts in general in terms of the whole thing. And I don't know if the same applies with Rust. I don't know if there's this sense, a genuine, authentic sense of a team who had one another's interests at heart and care about one another, specifically about Helena. Some people obviously do care about her, but what about everybody? Did everybody care? And I think you really need film sets where everyone cares about everyone else, including their safety, especially their safety. And what about the money train and who is liable here? According to the Washington Post, quote, according to Pressman, the Crow's insurance company said they would pay us what the film cost if we abandoned it or support us if we went ahead. They gave us a choice. But if Alex had not wanted to continue, I would have chosen to abandon the movie, end quote. So it's unclear what the insurance scenario will be on Rust, but clearly it is likely to be a factor. In our next analysis of intertextuality, we'll look at a far more current production with a very different legal outcome to The Crow. Midnight Rider was a 2014 drama. The production was halted when a camera woman, similar to Rust's cinematographer, was killed by a freight train on the first day of shooting. So I'm not going to take it further than that. I will play out with the sound effects from that fatal moment where the freight train approaches. I'll play out with that. But I want to just leave you with a few thoughts in terms of the new year. I know a lot of people say Happy New Year, and there's this weird sense where you sort of hope that the year is going to play out, the chips are going to fall in a way beneficial to you. And of course, everyone is wishing and hoping the same thing. And what I want to say to you is you make your own luck. And so if you want certain things for your life in 2022, then you're going to get them based on how hard you work towards that. You're going to have a good year based on how much you invest in the year being good. A lot of it's going to be a matter of your effort, right? Gary Player said something like, the harder I practice, the luckier I get. And so I wish you a year full of practice and full of the rewards that come as a result of dedication and work and effort. And if you're just hoping that the year is going to be kind to you, obviously that is an aspect, but you can certainly control that aspect to the extent that you work at it. And so I wish you a year filled with work ethic and the rewards that flow out of that. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.